Giving T4 only is like saying to a type 1 diabetic, well, I'm going to give you pro-insulin and your body's just going to make insulin, right? It's just not how that works. Most of us really do better when we have a combination of all the thyroid hormones, or at least if we're going to do synthetic, combination of clean T4 and T3. The biggest way to change our genes is at the end of our fork. So LDN is the cheapest, safest pharmaceutical that you've never heard of.
Welcome to The Trusted Pharmacist, where you'll learn the truth about how the body works. Welcome back to the Trusted Pharmacist podcast. I'm your host, Steve Hoffart, and today I am super excited to have a really good friend of mine and a phenomenal physician, clinician, Dr. Sarah Zielsdorf. She is a physician that truly embodies what it means to practice root cause, patient-centered care. Dr. Sarah Zielsdorf is an internal medicine physician and a functional medicine expert who has founded Motivated Medicine, a cutting-edge practice based in the Chicago area that specializes in complex, chronic conditions, especially things like thyroid disorders, autoimmune disease, and hormonal imbalances and digestive dysfunction. She holds a master's in microbiology and immunology. She has a medical degree from Loyola and is a board-certified internist, and she's also certified by the Institute of Functional Medicine. What sets her apart is her ability to bridge rigorous science and real-world healing with something she knows firsthand, as she's learned to do this as a Hashimoto's patient herself. Dr. Zielsdorf is also a national educator and medical advisor for the LDN Research Trust, helping to advance the use of low-dose naltrexone in chronic illness care. And beyond that, and being in the clinic and all the other things she does, she is a passionate advocate, joining me on Capitol Hill to fight for access to compounded medications and patient freedom. She's here today to talk about the truth behind autoimmune disease, how to heal the gut, the thyroid hormone connection, and how this all really works and what is going right in functional medicine today. Dr. Zielsdorf, welcome to the Trusted Pharmacist podcast.
Hi, Steve. Thanks so much for having me.
So great to have you. I love working and talking to you because you are so deep into the knowledge and the expertise and blending this whole functional medicine and allopathic medicine community together and making it happen to really bring better to patients. Just kind of as a start, tell me, using your title of your practice, which I love it, Motivated Medicine, tell me exactly what you do.
Well, it really came to me out of extremis, really, like any good idea, right? Is Mother Nature, really handed me a curveball. I was really in a huge transition and had to pivot in basically starting my own practice. It was never something that I wanted to do. Never, ever, ever wanted to run a business, do any of that. I wanted to be a good doctor, working somewhere. And that worked for a while until it didn't. And it really became necessary for me to start my own practice. And I'm in the Chicagoland area, and we were literally driving down the street, having to, I incorporated and had to figure out what's my name, and I liked the alliteration, where I think I came up with relentless medicine, and I was like, yeah, that's cool. And my aunt goes, oh, that's horrible. That sounds super negative. To me, that wasn't, because I'm super passionate about what I do. And I think my husband, helped. It was like, get motivated in that I want, it's a two-way street. My patients need to be motivated to change their lives, and sometimes really profoundly, and having to change many things to make a difference. And I'm motivated to get to the root cause of what's going on with the patient, which it's rare that it's one thing, as you know, because if things were such as humans are, that we were such simple creatures where it was one thing that really made someone sick, then I don't think any of us evolutionarily would have lived. It's usually a domino effect of many different variables. And you want to work with someone that really is in it for the long haul and that is super passionate about figuring out those things. And it really means, usually it's very wonky, often neurodivergent people like myself, that just love taking the time, and also really genuinely love working, just being with people, building relationships with people. And that takes a lot of time. My appointments with patients, a new patient visit is 90 minutes, and I see every new patient. I don't have staff do the intake. It has to really, the alchemy is really listening to a patient's story. And so that was really the birth of Motivated Medicine in 2019. I had a new baby at home. He was 9 months old when I started the practice. And I was actually starting the practice when I was teaching at the LDN conference in 2019. I was out in Portland and I was dealing with legal and I was doing all of this and I was seeing a patient. We started, there was, I think, a 2-week transition. Usually when a doctor changes, it's like a 6-month transition. We had like 2 weeks. It was insane. It was really insane. And motivated medicine was born out of that desire to do something really different. And they're just, that is not respected by insurance companies. As an internist, we get about 7 minutes, to see a patient. And really the model is seeing 20 to 30 patients a day. I can't do that in this model. And so it really was about doing something different and taking the time with my patients and being completely unapologetic about that.
But spending time with you, I can tell you this is like listening, I think, is your superpower. And I've learned that about you. You really like to take in, and that's the clinician part of you, that take in all this. You've got a tremendous amount of research knowledge that you have a lot. And I love how you love to listen. I've just kind of watched that in your ability. And I see that so much with patients nowadays, and you nailed it. That's why it doesn't work with the insurance model, because the insurance model does not pay you to listen. It pays you to make a diagnosis, but you have to do the listening before you can do the other. And that's one of those things. I appreciate you saying that. And the patients that come to us, just as much as we have to listen, we expect them. There's a quote on your website that says, if you're determined to take real charge of your health, we're determined to help you get real answers. And I appreciate that, because root cause medicine isn't easy for any of us as the practitioner or the patient. And I appreciate your ability to listen. I'd like to get your take on that, about how the body really is made to heal if we let it.
That's something that I didn't learn in all of my training, my 2 decades and lifelong commitment to training. Doctor means teacher. And I think the most challenging aspect is the daunting aspect of continuing education, which can really beat you down, with having to meet. We were talking about, I said, yeah, I'm a board certified internist, and I want to make sure I talk about that, because there are lifelong learning credits that you have, continuing education. It's very expensive and all of that. And it can be such a grind when you just have to say, answer questions or check a box. For me, it really is a passion for being around other clinicians such as yourself, and in different, I love working with the basic scientists, the researchers, the PhD that are in the lab. So for instance, I went back to my alma mater a few years ago and brokered a meeting with a mycoplasma expert, because I'm very, very interested in biofilms, for instance. And so I went literally to where this guy, I read his papers, and he happened to be at my alma mater. He started in the field there after I had graduated from my undergrad, so I didn't know him. But I had a meeting with him, and he was just dumbfounded, being like, I said, I use proteolytic enzymes for patients with chronic fatigue due to, mycoplasma. And he's like, well, mycoplasma is not a very pathogenic bug. It doesn't really have virulence factors. And I said, yeah, I know. But what it does do is it secretes a lot of IL-6, which creates a chronic inflammatory state and makes a patient, number one, susceptible to lots of other chronic viral reactivations, and makes them just really exhausted. And he was just dumbfounded by that. And I said, look, you're doing amazing research, but you're not talking with any clinicians about this. And there's no crosstalk. The same thing with physicians and working with pharmacists, who are just such a wealth of knowledge, right? Because I don't have that knowledge when it comes to saying, okay, number one, how do medications interact with each other, aside from obviously looking it up? But you don't have the decades of experience. And how can I personalize that treatment to a patient, which is where we can talk about our mutual love and passion for compounding. And I found this huge tribe of people, and we'll get at that with the advocacy work that I do, with regard to compounding, and having a like-minded group of people that are all about the patient in front of them, and personalized medicine and precision medicine.
And I love how you got that. Like, you went to the root cause to find a research paper, somebody working in a lab that doesn't even work with people, but works with the bacteria. But you're right. And we're not just a petri dish. We're so much more complicated. But it is all these little chemical reactions that are happening all throughout the body that interplay with our systems, that interplay with everything, that you really have to look at them. And that's the whole root cause thing. It's going and trying to find where all these little answers are. And I really appreciate that about you. Tying into that, I think about this in your own story. I know you always tell your Hashimoto's thyroid story, and it's kind of what got you down this road of like, and I hear this all the time. We put social media stuff about low thyroid, and you're a clinician, and you struggled to figure out how to get the ball rolling in the right way on your thyroid. Tell me a little bit about what that taught you to be a different clinician nowadays because of your own struggle with that.
So it's incredibly personal. Number one, I could be very cynical and I could be very angry about, frankly, losing my youth to this disease. I was 19 when I was diagnosed hypothyroid, and very briefly, I was in college. I developed likely mono that went to my ear during a college internship, and I probably lived in a moldy basement apartment in Pittsburgh. I still don't like Pittsburgh. I don't like the Steelers anyway. I'm from Cleveland. But I had a really horrible experience, got really, really sick. And, the time course fits that subsequent spring, I started sleeping more and more. I was a junior in college. I was sleeping through my classes all day, really sick, found to have a thyroid nodule and elevated TSH. And they said, okay, we're going to put you on Synthroid. And I did not feel well on that for a while. I was actually treated at Cleveland Clinic by another doctor who actually did use small amounts of T3 for me. And I felt marginally better, but then I graduated, lost insurance, et cetera, and was put on the standard of care medicine. During none of those interactions in my early years was I ever asked about my family history, where I have multiple family members, including my mother and grandmother. My mother was hypothyroid already and was on thyroid replacement. And my grandmother had multiple autoimmune diseases, her mother. And so I'm third generation, and I have a child with autoimmunity, fourth generation. We have a very strong family history. And if they would have done that research and known the fact that 90 to 95% of hypothyroidism in the United States is really secondary to Hashimoto's or another autoimmune thyroid disease, such as if someone has Graves or thyrotoxicosis and they have to have their thyroid irradiated, leading to permanent hypothyroidism and requirements for medication. Nobody did that work. I progressively got sicker and sicker and sicker through the early years of my marriage, my graduate work. I ended up having two major flares. The first flare was during my first year of medical school, necessitating my first leave of absence. And we're talking about losing years of my life total. The second was during my first year of residency, which coincides with huge amounts of stress, right? And it wasn't until my second flare where I ended up bedbound. And I, from my bed, started learning functional medicine because I had to figure out my own answers. I literally stripped naked and got into a gown and had the dean of medicine at my medical school, who I respect to this day very much. I humbled myself and said, please examine me. I'm not crazy. And he said, I know you're not crazy, but I don't know what's going on with you. I actually developed a terribly enlarged liver because of my metabolic state. I was incredibly hypothyroid for 10 years, right? And that does not go away. I have, serious ramifications of that, forever because of my poor treatment. And it took a long time to figure out, how to help me. I ended up being told I would never have children. And that really lit a fire under me. And I changed my diet. Obviously, I had extensive dietary, changes, committing to eating an unprocessed diet, committing to being gluten-free, was able to lose a lot of weight, was able to get on proper medication that encompassed all of the thyroid hormones, T4, T3, T2, T1, calcitonin, and trace amounts of iodine, which are in natural desiccated thyroid. And for me, I require both that and compounded. I require compounded T3 as well to just maintain my livelihood. I have absolutely no thyroid function of my own. And I mourn that, I do. And I could be very cynical and very angry, but I used to channel my revenge is helping people. My revenge is being able to help people, especially my favorite is when I see another college-age thyroid patient and I'm able to get them on the right track early, or they've got antibodies and we're able to get them on LDN and we save them from having to be on thyroid meds. That's incredible. It's incredible. And, it's a process. And I was able to have two children and I have, an amazing career, an amazing family. I want to personally say I have a husband that I've been married to for 20 years and he's supported me through it all. And that's another thing that I always say with my patients. I always advocate for you to bring your support with you to appointments, especially a lot of our patients who are really sick are brain fogged and really scared and also, frankly, traumatized, have PTSD, medical PTSD. So I always say, bring your safe person with you, have them take notes. It really is a red flag when we see women, who are alone in our office and who don't have that support. I really do say, it's so hard being chronically ill because it's the number one driver of divorce in families. And so I'm very grateful. I've had my husband, Jason, has been my rock for a very long time, and he supports me. But to this, and it's really interesting because he knows when I'm flaring. He will call me out on that, and knows that, I have to manage my sleep. I have to manage my stress. I have to manage my diet. I have to manage, and get my labs. I have to do all of those things. And it's really a challenge. It really is. And there's no one silver bullet with autoimmunity. That's the other thing that I have to say. So it's really driven, my practice was driven by finding answers myself. And I don't have all of the answers, but it's helped me to be able to, take care of thousands of thyroid patients over the last decade, and probably, teach hundreds of pharmacists to be able to prescribe, combinations of thyroid meds that help others,
Yeah. And your life experience, I think we as clinicians are always better when we've gone through something. So you have a lot to unpack there. So I want to throw out a couple of different things. I hear this all the time that my doctor will only do a TSH. And I'm like, and it's like, if there was probably any one thing not to check, it is not to, because they don't even measure thyroid, but as a compounding pharmacist, and you get this, probably more than the majority of people are just given T4 only, and they're not even looking at T3. And I think, tell me your experience about the T4 only patient versus the patients that are getting T4 and T3 together, and that overall benefit and outcome, because it isn't easy for the body to convert T4 to T3, and there's so many things that can go wrong.
So let's unpack this really quick from a very high level. So the American Thyroid Association a couple years ago came out honestly with a hit piece. They said that the majority of reverse T3 labs are drawn by a relatively small number of practitioners in the United States, namely functional medicine practitioners. And the connotation is that this is wrong, that there's never an indication for this. And I recently had an insurance company basically cite the ATA with their article and basically said, we're never covering this. And I think it was Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina. So I immediately fired off an email with, I think, 400 primary references, and my staff said, you can't do that. So I had to go back and just basically cherry pick a couple of, references. But yeah, I get pretty angry, all caps, and I'm about to yell at them. And I'm not allowed to do that. The bottom line is it's never going to be accepted. So you have to first just understand that unless the endocrinologist or primary care physician or another clinician, OB-GYNs often deal with thyroid space too, unless you have a clinician that either is hypothyroid, that either has a family member that has been going through this, or has a deep understanding of this, there is going to be a reticence or an outright refusal to get other labs in the standard of care. The standard of care is to order a TSH test. The TSH is a measure of a hormone that's produced by the pituitary gland, and it signals the thyroid to produce T4, which is actually a pro-hormone, which gets converted to T3 in the interstitial fluid in the gut, and we're going to get at the gut because it's so critical, right? And if you don't have a good functioning liver, which I just started to say that if you are hypothyroid, you can't convert T4 to T3. And we are going to be prone to developing fatty livers. Back in 2008, when I was sick, this was not known. PCOS, other conditions that drive metabolic disease. It is critical. We knock out the liver, and then we start to get poor conversion, elevation of reverse T3, which is inactive. So T3, which is free T3, which is the active thyroid hormone, which interacts directly with receptors on cells, has the same receptor site as reverse T3, which is inactive. And I always liken this to the gas pedal and the brake pedal. And it's really wise. We've got a system that helps us to slow our metabolism when we need it, such as pregnancy or critical illness or extreme stress. It helps us to conserve our metabolism for the things that are needed. So for instance, I'm probably guilty of running too many RT3s on everybody. It's a send out, it's tough to get, it's expensive, but there is utility in this because, for instance, RT3 triples in pregnancy. I know this because I've been measuring it in hundreds of pregnant women. And so I like to optimize a woman's RT3 before she gets pregnant. She'll have a better outcome. She won't gain as much weight. She won't have as much risk of gestational diabetes or other things if we can control some of those other parameters. That's my experience. It's not proven, and it's not accepted in allopathic medicine. Not everybody needs T3. And that's another, if you are a well-oiled machine and you don't have polymorphisms in what we call deiodinases, which are enzymes, by the way, anything that ends in an ACE is an enzyme. That's how I explain it to patients. But an enzyme is something that just helps to make the chemical reactions in our body work thousands of times faster. Anyway, we have these little buggers called deiodinase, which literally deiodinate, meaning to take off an iodine. So you go from 4 iodines to 3 iodines, 2 iodines to 1 iodine. And that's the process of how we have thyroid hormones that require iodine, which is a whole nother huge topic. And I still struggle with that because too much iodine can be a bad thing. Too little iodine is bad. And I live in the rust belt, what we call the goiter belt, because we have lots of patients who develop goiters because we don't get the iodine that we need. And so that's super interesting. It's profoundly complicated. But not everybody needs T4. T3 is the active thyroid hormone. And so I prefer to look at a whole patient's history, all of their labs, and we talk to them. And so this is kind of just a general statement. It's not true of everybody. But the longer that someone is on T4 only, the more normal their TSH is, the more normal their T4 is. But compared to another patient who isn't on thyroid hormone, their RT3s are going to be higher and their free T3s are going to be lower. So what I like to do to look at and establish euthyroidism, because TSH really tells us not much, as you alluded to. TSH really is tells us the pituitary and the brain milieu of hypothyroidism or euthyroidism. But how I look at if a person has, good thyroid function is really, because I can't look at it under a microscope, is a ratio of their free T3 to reverse T3. I like to see that over 20. And when we see that ratio is really off and a patient's really symptomatic and they've been on T4 for a long time, we say, okay, it might behoove us to try a combination medicine. And I can break that down as to the different medicines. There are 2 main pitfalls of that. We want to make sure that they've got good ferritin levels, good iron storage, and that their adrenals are good. Otherwise, they may not tolerate T3. And the most common side effect is palpitations and problems. Now, I will say this too. Endocrinologists hate T3 for a very fundamental reason. In the 1980s, there was a little thing called the rise of bodybuilding post, Arnold Schwarzenegger won Mr. Olympia, I think in 1977. After that, there was the rise of bodybuilding and everybody was using T3 to get lean. And we had a whole rash of people doing insulin and T3 and testosterone and all these things. And we had a rash of bodybuilders die of heart attacks in the 80s. And thus there were generations of endocrinologists now that have been taught that T3 is dangerous. T3 causes heart attacks. T3 is speed. Well, yeah, if you give it to someone who doesn't have hypothyroidism, sure. But it can be life-saving for those of us who cannot make that hormone on our own. I also liken it to this. Giving T4 only is like saying to a type 1 diabetic, well, I'm going to give you pro-insulin and your body's just going to make insulin, right? It's just not how that works. And so most of us really do better when we have a combination of all the thyroid hormones, or at least if we're going to do synthetic, combination of clean T4 and T3.
No, and that's a great point. I appreciate you breaking that down because it is complicated, but kind of once you dive in, it's really not. But you do have to monitor those things to get it right versus saying what symptoms are, just guessing. What are your thoughts just quickly on checking thyroid antibodies, thyroglobulin antibodies, TPO and stuff like that? At some point, everybody, especially if they got low thyroid, should have that checked. But I feel like a lot of doctors don't check it because they're like, okay, you got Hashimoto's. I don't know what to do with it. So they don't even want to check it. But it's an autoimmune disease and there's a problem there, right?
So I do check it. I check it on everybody. And I check also ANA. I prefer actually an AVISE test, which is the gold standard for rheumatology, because it will screen ANA in a couple of different ways. It's more sensitive and specific. And it will check TPO and thyroglobulin antibodies. It's very sensitive, very specific. If it can be covered, I have a way to get it covered by insurance. But it will rule out lupus. It will rule out Sjogren's. It will rule out mixed connective tissue disease, polymyositis, bunch of other autoimmune conditions. We know where there's smoke, there's fire. And in general, patients who develop one autoimmune disease often develop multiple. In fact, 25% of autoimmune patients have 3 or more autoimmune diseases. That's called polyautoimmunity. Now, there's a difference between autoimmunity and autoimmune disease. So all of us have autoimmunity. We all make autoantibodies to things, and we all make cancer cells, but not all of us has cancer and not all of us has autoimmune disease. The difference, and we're getting closer to that. There's actually a prize that was just given out for someone doing more of the physiology of this, but the definition of an autoimmune disease is end organ damage to a tissue or a gland. And that we can actually see in an ultrasound or in a biopsy of an organ as what we call lymphocytic infiltrate. You're looking for B cells that have caused chronic inflammation and damage to a cell or to a gland or to tissue. And so I always measure these antibodies. And the problem is endocrinologists will say, well, it doesn't matter. I'm going to treat you the same. Well, we know that in patients with normal TSHs, if they've got high antibodies, it often is better to treat them if they're highly symptomatic. They have better quality of life, especially if it's in the high normal, category and they've been suffering and they want treatment. They want a trial of treatment. We also know that patients with autoantibodies, this is the tough part. The number does not really denote how symptomatic someone is. Someone can have 5 of TPO or 5 million and not necessarily have symptoms that correlate. And so that's another problem because people will be like, it doesn't matter. I do happen to follow the antibodies. I like it as another, a marker. I don't measure it every time in someone with Hashis. But here's the rub. Somebody who does not have any antibodies on when I first talk to them and I first do their labs, they actually may not be able to make antibodies because they're so burned out and their immune system is struggling. And then I actually start treating them and lo and behold, they have antibodies or their antibodies explode. And that's really difficult because patients are like, oh my God, I didn't have antibodies and now I do. What happened? And so it's super complicated. It's really, really complicated. And it's only one piece of the puzzle. And I want to say one other thing about antibodies. The wild card about Hashimoto's is that we know that via molecular mimicry, we make other autoantibodies, not just against the thyroid, but that you can make antibodies against muscle. So one of the things that I presented with was fibromyalgia-like symptoms. And it really is a hallmark of Hashimoto's. We can make antibodies against muscle. 40% of Hashimoto's patients also have small fiber neuropathy, which mimics MS. And so I had an MS workup with that too. And in reality, it was my Hashis. And hypothyroidism causes up to 300 symptoms. So it can make for really, really highly suffering patients. And we also know that, thyroid cancer is, quote, the good cancer. It's got a very, very high survival rate, but those patients have some of the worst quality of life. Why is that? You take their thyroid gland. And you were asking kind of what the difference is. I want to also make one big statement. This is another pearl. We call them WAT patients without a thyroid patient. They have to be treated differently than those with a thyroid. And so often those without a thyroid need about half of in my experience, half of their replacement in T3. They often need more T3.
It's great information. And you're right that we're in an explosion of autoimmune conditions. And that I always tell patients is you don't get an autoimmune condition overnight. I mean, this is something that is progressive. It's got a continuum. It didn't start and it doesn't have an end. And like you said, if you don't work on some of the root causes, it's going to turn in from 1 to 2 to 3. There's 100 plus autoimmune conditions. What do you see nowadays as the main root cause triggers for autoimmune conditions?
So we're American, right? Our toxic waste dump of our food system is huge. And just that we're all marinating in stress and toxic blue light. We're really screwing up our circadian rhythms. We're working too much. We're sitting too much. We're eating ultra processed junk. And it's this experiment gone wrong, right? So just take our story of American wheat, right? Things changed. Things changed in the 70s and 80s as we had the rise of hybridized wheat. It's a different chromosome number than what, white European, descended Americans, would have eaten. It's all been sprayed with Roundup, which is a toxin to our gut. We're getting massive amounts of, stress that people are under. There's just, everything is just so fast compared to previous generations, right? I see it in our kids, Just kids are growing up so fast. And also just think about all the endocrine disruptors, right? Girls used to say, oh, that's precocious puberty if it's like they're having, their period at 9. But now we see 8 as on the regular. That's scary. That's super, super scary. And so I really see it as all of those things. Our genes didn't change, but our environment surely is accelerating in the wrong direction.
Yeah. And one of the challenges you've already talked about, there's a difference between autoimmunity and autoimmune disease. And so how do you calm an overactive immune system, but not suppress it? Because you're right. We have to protect. That's the whole problem with autoimmune conditions. Now, with all these drug commercials I see on TV, it drives me crazy because it slams that immune system one direction. And hey, you need your immune system for a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
How do you find that happy medium there? What are the first tools you look to do to kind of to reset that?
So what's so interesting is women are literally wired differently than men. We know this. And the number one thing is to strengthen and reset that parasympathetic nervous system. We are all in sympathetic dominance. We all are. And it is really tough because I always liken it to a bodybuilder, who doesn't do leg day. We see those big, huge upper bodies and tiny, tiny chicken legs. And that's what our nervous system imbalance is. We have this sympathetic dominance where we have big, huge upper body and tiny chicken legs of the parasympathetic nervous system. So we have fight or flight with the sympathetic nervous system and rest and digest with the parasympathetic. This is simplified, but the largest cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, really is the seat of the parasympathetic nervous system. And there are a ton of different ways now to help modulate that. There are devices, and then there are cheapy ways to do that. I have my patients hum. I have them sing at the top of their lungs in the shower. I have them gargle when they brush their teeth. And so gargling helps to stimulate the vagal motor nuclei, which are the closest area is the base of our brain, when the back of our throat helps to vibrate that. And doing some of these simple things, focusing on diaphragmatic breath, taking up a yoga practice. For my senior yoga for patients, chair yoga, you can get, free things online. And then there are programs like HeartMath, which help us to actually measure heart rate variability. And there are wearables. I'm really old school. I don't love a lot of wearable stuff, but for my patients who really do like it, it can be really helpful. But that's number one. Taking at least 3 months to really decompress that sympathetic overdrive can be really helpful. And then, the biggest way to change our genes is at the end of our fork. So really going toward an autoimmune friendly and anti-inflammatory diet, and just being really there's a lot of controversy about using continuous glucose monitors for non-diabetics, but I read that, only 2% of Americans are metabolically flexible, which means 98% of us are insulin resistant and, have diabetes. So I use CGMs to just let people, even for 2 weeks, to see what is it that they're eating that might have this crazy response. And for me, I was really upset. I was about to rip the thing out of my arm, but I had the hugest response I had was having honey in my green tea. And I was really angry about it. I was like, really? That's like the only thing. And dang it, honey is really good for you. And it is, but it spikes my sugar like none other. And so for me, not being metabolically flexible because of all of these conditions that I've developed due to my longstanding hypothyroidism, I can't do that. And I really have to be careful. And it's really tough too, because I have a very low hemoglobin A1C, but I'm insulin resistant. So it leads to like this hypo situation with brittle blood sugar. And I see that a lot in perimenopause. And so I didn't even talk about that. But then you throw perimenopause in the picture for women, and that is another key driver of autoimmunity. So I talk about it a lot in the books the chapters I've written, but being a woman really predisposes us to autoimmune via our extra X chromosome. We've got a susceptibility there, and also all the hormonal fluctuations. The most common time to develop thyroid disease is peripartum. And so pregnancy-induced thyroiditis is very, very common. And so we see these shifts, and in the perimenopausal time, the time of great upheaval and increase of inflammation, systemic inflammation, insulin resistance, and driver toward autoimmune.
So two quick things. One, you mentioned CGMs. That tends to come up almost every single conversation I have with a practitioner nowadays and the value those bring. And I'm like I always thought carbohydrate. I mean, I know broccoli's a carbohydrate and sugar's a carbohydrate and strawberries a carbohydrate. What I didn't realize is that all of us are so unique. And this is that personalized medicine approach, because you're right. You can't eat honey and maybe I can. Where, like you said, the craziest thing is, and until you put on that CGM and find out what spikes your blood sugar for you, but gut bacteria, genetics, all these other things, that part's really kind of amazing that a CGM can teach us that.
Yeah. And it's really about, not perfection, but saying, I'm like, look, I want to see where you have an 80-point swing. I want to see where your blood sugar doesn't come down 2 hours after you eat. It's just going to help us to make better decisions, out of this just nebulous world of nutrition and saying, don't eat this and don't eat that. It really is a very personal thing. And anything that can give us more data and help to make it less just anxiety producing for someone who so desperately wants to affect their health, that's a helpful thing.
One thing you kind of touched on, you mentioned this 3-month thing. When people have long-term stress, where I don't really like to use the word adrenal fatigue, but you have HPA dysfunction and those type things, what's your timetable you typically like to treat people, and you're realistic upfront with patients? We're going to have to do these things for X number of months to see a difference because we didn't get here overnight. What's your kind of rule of thumb with that?
So for adrenal dysfunction, I'm hardcore adamant. Just for circadian rhythm, they need 6 months. 6 months. I mean, we're talking we're talking even having them go camping, if we can have you get out of technology for a week, really detoxing from a lot of this stuff, using adaptogens, using, every tool in my toolbox that I can. We were talking about inflammation, and we'll get at LDN. I use low-dose naltrexone a lot for inflammation, and for autoimmune, but it takes time. I'm upfront. When we're talking about wanting to heal dysbiosis or gut stuff, I really talk about on the order of 2 years, because we have to have a lot of cellular turnover. I use fasting for patients who have decent adrenals. And I've had to work up to it myself, but to be able to fast, can be really helpful. Just to really start to drive, drive change for autophagy, cellular turnover, and really making you a new person, No,
and that's great. I love that you said that. And I think sometimes that gets missed in terms of this whole stress thing, that it does take time. And especially when you're taking this root cause approach and looking at all the different things, our bodies will heal, but we have to give them a chance, and we have to give them time, because like you said, I appreciate your talk on that. There's like a million things I could jump into, and I want to be respectful for time. So let's kind of jump into another quick things, and then I want to get into LDN. You and I have talked about microbiomes. You're a microbiome guru, from gut microbiome. You and I have talked vaginal microbiome and all this kind of stuff. What do you see as the big things in the microbiome world nowadays that are kind of important, that maybe people are overlooking, but that really set them up for health?
So, I mean, obviously I keep harping on diet. We got to have people restoring short chain fatty acids to the large bowel. And this is a really big problem because all of us have SIBO, basically. All of us have overgrowths. And a lot of my patients can't handle starches now. Their guts are so sick. And so what do we do when someone has autoimmune disease? Oh, go gluten-free. Well, we might have just really committed a crime for their microbiome because they're not getting those fibers. Like wheat is really, really good for feeding the microbiome. And so I always tell them then they've got to eat root veggies. They've got to make skillets. I have them, cook, cool, and reheat things, and then have them timed eating for carbohydrates along the time that they're lifting for someone who's insulin resistant. I'm very cognizant of wanting all the colors of the rainbow. I mean, there's no accident. I was reading about how, for instance, maca, which is a Peruvian plant that grows in the Andes. Very interesting. The color of the plant, and there are dozens of species, is Deanna Minnick was talking about this. She's a PhD nutrition expert, and she was talking about how the altitude determines, it's not the seed, it's the altitude that determines the color or the characteristic of the plant, which is so fascinating. And so I'm not a pharmacognosist. I don't, I definitely don't have a green thumb. I kill plants, but I have a great appreciation for them. My husband will agree with this. I'm terrible at gardening. But I love people who garden and I love supporting my local farms. So being able to eat locally is huge. If you can consume honey, having bees that are local, that's really important for your immune system. And so that is really important. The soil that you're getting your food from is, our soil is so depleted. That's why we all need supplements. When I check my micronutrients, a carrot is not the same as it was from a 1940s carrot, which is crazy. So short chain fatty acids, resistant starches, ferments, we've lost the art of fermented foods. So being able to eat a spoonful of a ferment every day of the week, even if your kids think it's gross, make a game of having them put it in their mouth and spitting it out. They don't have to swallow it. We want to keep trying, we want all of, that. Some dark horse things that I just want to bring up are LDN, which we're going to talk about, peptides, which we're going to talk about. I absolutely love serum bovine immunoglobulins. I use the crap out of them. I love them. They help to bind up toxins that are going through the gut wall. I use a lot of enzymes for patients. I really love digestive bitters as ancient wisdom, ancient herbs that have been used. Bitters came up, from, men would get sick from drinking, alcohol. So, the Swedes started using these bitter plants and they were sidecars, right? They helped in their mixed drinks, but they helped take away the toxicity of the alcohol. So I always joke around, the sidecars of the old man drinks with the bitters, is old man wisdom about it. And so what digestive bitters do is they really help to thin the bile and increase the hormone secretion and the conversation that happens between the stomach and the pancreas and the gallbladder to be able to emulsify fats and be able to, encourage enough, digestive juices and all of the enzymes to be able to help us digest and process our food.
Yeah, and I found bitters very helpful. We just have a plethora of people that are just stuck on PPIs for years, and bitters are one of my go-tos to help patients get off of those. Yes. Like you said, we have a rash of that, and those cause all kinds of problems, as you well know. All right, so let's jump in. Everything you've talked about today, from gut health, inflammation, Hashimoto's, autoimmune, there's this little magic thing called low-dose naltrexone, which can do wonders for these patients. It's not the end-all be-all. You know that, but it's one piece of a puzzle that can be quite amazing. Just your quick overview, if you had your elevator pitch to a person who's on LDN, what do you tell somebody?
So LDN is the cheapest, safest pharmaceutical that you've never heard of. And just very personally, I had a massive flare after the birth of my daughter. My physician, may he rest in peace, my physician put me on LDN, and it rapidly restored my health and my flare within a month. And that's not super common, but can happen. So what naltrexone does is it's not giving you a medicine like a PPI will shut off a proton pump inhibitor will shut off the pumps, for making acid. It doesn't do something to your body. The beauty of what naltrexone does, which needs to be compounded in a low dose, which is cheap, which ends up being $20 or $30 a month, not covered by insurance, but is gluten and dairy free and made by angels like Steve at his pharmacy. It absolutely works with your body. So when someone has a chronic illness or a chronic inflammatory process or has had PTSD or has been sick, depressed for a very long period of time, we have lowered amounts of endorphins in our body. And so what this drug does is if you use a low enough dose of naltrexone on the order of 0.5 to 4.5 milligrams, you will very briefly block the opioid receptors, and there are multiple receptors in the central nervous system. And we know that this also crosstalks with many other tissues and receptors, but you will briefly block that. And when it unblocks, the receptor's confused. He's like, oh crap, I was asleep. And he has to quickly make more of his product because he's afraid he's going to be fired. So he makes more of his products, which are beta endorphin and metenkephalin. Beta endorphin helps with mood, with pain, with sleep. And we know, for instance, that endometriosis patients, women with endometriosis, have lower levels of endorphins. We've known that for decades. So if we can restore that, we really help with quality of life. Metenkephalins also work on the not only endorphin pathway and the opioid pathway, but have far-reaching effects in our immune system. They can help with T cells. They can help with propensity for driving that autoimmune response, and they can take out that inflammation. And it can be really helpful for patients with autoimmunity. We have some patients who really have a tremendous difference with mast cell activation as well, because it can stabilize mast cells and helpful for the allergy response for patients who are sensitive to everything. And we have patients who their mood gets better. And I will tell you, I was always a glass half empty person in my life. I was not a happy person, and I very much struggled with treatment-resistant depression throughout my life. And the addition of naltrexone completely changed my worldview. It really, really changed my outlook. And it persistently helps. And it really is working with a good pharmacist and clinician and the patient to find the sweet spot dose.
No, and that's exactly right. And I like what you said. That's one of the aha effects I see with LDN. A lot of patients say is, I didn't want to get off the couch. I didn't want to exercise. I didn't want to move. I had a bad attitude. And then all of a sudden, that's like one of those things like I don't feel like I talk about as much, but that willingness to get up, be motivated to do things is something that I really enjoy. And a lot of times people will take LDN for a while. It's like, it just doesn't work anymore. And then they get off. And then to me, it's about 6 to 8 weeks. They're like, wait a minute. I forgot what this felt like. I want to go back and get on it. So,
that's what happened to me. I've been on and off it, and I realized, oh man, I really am much better on it than I am off it. Yeah.
Right. And, it's very personalized. And the thing I've learned nowadays, as well as me, this whole opioid system in our body and all these interleukins it affects and the immune system, everybody is so sensitive and overstimulated. I'm seeing lower and lower doses. And a lot of conditions, I think, stay away from it because it takes some work. It takes a little bit of effort. But many clinicians struggle with the dosings. What have you learned about like kind of titration, timing, response patterns? That's kind of like the new data, because I've seen this change just in the last 3 to 4 years.
Yeah. So that's the real importance of all of us getting together that do this medicine, because we are finding BID dosing, so twice a day dosing, or even further. I don't personally like to give multiple time a day dose unless I have to, because compliance is a concern and none of us want to be tied to a timer taking pills all day. But starting lower and slower, using a liquid, dosing regimen to be able to get to the tenths of milligrams or even microgram level can be really helpful for patients. Patients who are really sensitive need to go very slowly. For say a Hashimoto's patient who isn't super sensitive to meds, I'll start at 0.5 and I'll work up every 2 weeks. And what I'm trying to find is what we consider this maximum effective dose. So where they're sleeping well, they're not hindered in their appetite, they're not having GI problems. And as with just like any other medicine, one of the most common side effects are, funky gut or having headaches or sleep disturbance is really common. And so if patients have sleep disturbance, I have them switch it to the daytime. You can also have vivid dreams. I have literally had to counsel people. I'm like, please don't do shrooms and start LDN at the same time, because I don't know what that's going to do to your dreams. So I usually say it's not a contraindication for having alcohol, but I usually say, let's start the LDN and not imbibe and not do those other things right now, because in high doses, we use naltrexone to help with alcohol and opioid dependence. So we want to be careful with some of those other things. But I go low and slow, and I try to find that maximum effective dose. And it can take months to do. A lot of patients, thyroid patients, will be lower. They'll be on the order of 1 milligram or 1.5 milligrams. But some, especially if there is a very predominant pain component, they'll need to get up, or they have a very bad gut, very malabsorbing gut. They may need 6 milligrams. They may need 9 milligrams. And Dr. Paul Anderson, who I love, I always give him credit where credit is due. He coined the term high-low dose naltrexone, which is really up to 12 milligrams. And there's some people in Europe that are doing this funky reverse titration. Well, they'll start people at like 12 to help with the inflammation, and then they'll bring them down. I don't tend to do that because I'm frankly not brave enough. But it's out there. There's a lot of different regimens for it.
No, that's good. That's good insight. You're right. I constantly see it change. And I think how it's changed just the last 10 years that I've been seeing it. But it's a powerful drug in what it does, and part of this whole wellness picture in terms of helping patients get well. I don't know about you, but I have been getting hounded with calls about peptides. Can you compound them? Do you have them? These are the greatest things ever. What's your take on peptides right now? Like it's definitely the hot thing in functional medicine.
So we were talking literally about this, and I think you and I share the same passion for just reading about it and still having to have a healthy skepticism as clinicians too, because it is our license. Like if we're giving something to someone and then it causes something terrible down the road, there's so much that we don't know. And I literally just saw in the headline today about GLPs being more than doubly associated with macular degeneration in elderly. And we already know that it can cause a rare stroke of the eye, a non-ischemic stroke of the eye. We also know that there's an association with pancreatitis and other, even thyroid cancer. And so I have to be able to counsel my patients on GLPs, and where for some, we also know that microdosing can be really helpful for inflammation for some patients, right? There's some patients where that's the missing piece, and others where it really is a no-go. We also really worry. I'm just tackling GLPs at the top. So your Ozempics, your Wegovys, your Zepbounds, your Mounjaros. There is a huge fight right now with FDA. People may not know this, but there's been lawsuits and the inability for compounders to compound GLPs, semaglutide or tirzepatide. These are classic peptides. So these are examples of peptides, and probably anywhere you read, it's 1 out of 7 or 1 out of 8 Americans has been on a GLP-1 now. That's crazy. That's remarkable. That's very remarkable. And I always use it in Spider-Man terms, with great power comes great responsibility. So when I talk about these, I talk about them treading very lightly. I was trained in GLPs because we had a couple of them that we were using in the diabetes space when I trained. And I haven't been out of medical school that long, but in the early 2000s, we were using some. And we had very, very mixed kind of results. And I don't know how you felt as a pharmacist, in that space. The same thing about, some can cause kidney problems, some don't. Some can cause liver problems, some don't. I think that it's very nebulous and very, tough. And then we've got other doctors in the functional medicine space who primarily use peptides, and they use a ton, and they are super knowledgeable about them. And I want to highlight a few that I do use that are acid stable, and I use them as oral peptides. And I do find that they are very helpful in the short term. And I'll just highlight a couple of them. Now, I think peptides should not be used permanently. I think they should be used in as a means to an end. And I think that's a really difficult thing for the whole GLP discussion. We have diabetics who absolutely need it. We have patients with heart disease that need it. We have patients who really have their lives changed and do really well. Like one of my colleagues, Jessica Flanagan, was just on social media talking about using it for menopause and has done just remarkably well. And I just think we have to have a very healthy respect for these things. 3 that I have had personal experience with in my clinic are BPC 157, which is wonderful. It is actually an anti-ulcer peptide. And just to back up, a peptide is a short string of amino acids, usually 3 amino acids or so, that mimics a protein. The most wonderful thing for our autoimmune patients is that peptides will not cause an autoimmune response. We can make an antibody to any protein, but we can't make it to a peptide. So that's what's really beautiful and what really excites me about peptides. So BPC is really great for gut healing. It's really great for, patients who are burning the candle at both ends, and we really want to, or if they've had an injury, a joint injury, things like that. KPV is another. It's a component of alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone. It's really great for mast cells, really great for allergy, really great for inflammation. It's really great for our mold patients. And then finally, lorazepam is another that we use, which is a zonulin agonist. It helps to rebuild the gut lining. It was actually used in case studies for children with massive immune response with COVID called MIS. And it saved lives. And it was in a clinical trial for curing celiac. Well, no, it's not going to cure celiac because you can't eat gluten. The test is, can you eat gluten? I'm like, no, you can't eat gluten with celiac disease. But I think that a lot of these things are not ready for prime time. And we just don't know how these things are going to affect us long term. And that's why I always just say caution. I really want a reason to use the peptide, not that it's just like, I really want to give you a peptide, right? There's got to be a real reason for it, and that I'm using it for a very specific reason. They're very expensive. They're very, very expensive, even orally. And we're going to say this over and over again. You want to make sure you're getting it from a reputable source too.
Yeah, for sure. And that's the pharmacist to me. These people that are just ordering them off the internet randomly with no provider supervision and all that, that's the part that scares the heck out of me. Because like I'm not against really GLP-1s if they're dosed right, done right, proper diet, proper nutrition, monitored. They have a place. I mean, our body makes these peptides. That's how it does. And if they're done right, it has a purpose as far as that goes. But I appreciate your insight on that, because I don't know about you, but that's like the go-to thing right now as far as that goes. I want to wrap with one last thing, which is something that I want to tell you thank you. And what I mean by this is a couple years back, I showed up in Washington, D.C. with one of my patients that I compound for, because I go to Washington, D.C. to be the voice for the voiceless that don't get to go to Washington, that don't get to go tell their story, because our patients need customized medications. And there was this doctor there, Dr. Zielsdorf, that was there with just as much passion as me about telling her story and the story of her patients, and why customized medications are essential for quality of life and a number of gamuts. And I really want to tell you thank you, because your time is so valuable. For you to come to Washington and do that means a lot to me as a pharmacist. And I want to say thank you. I really mean that. I appreciate your time that you take away from your office and your patients to come be with us and tell your story. And it means a lot. What you delivered today is what I'm looking for. It's what our audience is looking for. You have such a passion to learn, and more importantly, your desire to really want to help patients and spread the message. And you did so much of that. And I really want to tell you thank you. I appreciate you sharing today and giving so many great pearls. I want to thank you a lot.
And thank you for what you do. I get to hear such great, I just like to see your passion, just getting on, it's never about selling a supplement or selling a product. It just comes across very clearly that you're all about education, you're all about passion, and, seeing what you can do in your community, and it really shows.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So if people want to learn more about you and find out more about what Dr. Zielsdorf do, where can they find you at?
Motivatedmedicine.com. Right now, I have a very long wait list, but I do have other clinicians that are seeing patients. We do need people to come in person. I don't have a telemed practice. So if you're in the Midwest and can come, it would be wonderful to meet you. And, you can read about us on the site. We are a consultative practice. I don't do primary care, but we're very, very passionate about what we do.
Awesome. Don't lose that fire. You're a phenomenal clinician. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.